Welcome to my first official/unofficial beginning of a new series that I've been working on called Creative Habits. Basically a series where I just sit down and draw something in my sketchbook. Compared to my regular videos, these are likely to be a bit less edited. Basically less drama content and more content about me making art. And basically where I yap for about 15 to 20 minutes talking about art-related topics. Or whatever piece I happen to be working on. Now, I don't know how frequently I will be doing this series, but it is definitely something that I want to keep working on this year. Basically, as you know, if you've been on the internet for quite a while, there's a lot of brain rot content out there. So I want this series to be like a pit stop from that, if that makes sense. With things like AI out there, stopping and actually appreciating the way that artists create art is something that I still crave when it comes to art content. And I mainly want to focus this series on traditional art because I feel like it doesn't get enough love on social media these days. Though I might throw in a couple digital art videos if I think that they'll fit this series a bit more than my regular content. I'm currently looking into ways to make my traditional art setup a bit more sustainable, because like currently I film a lot of this on my phone, and if I film too long on my phone it overheats, and it sort of messes up with the footage from what I found. And I definitely want to do more traditional art content where I try different supplies and test out different techniques, but it's been hard to do that when my only source of recording isn't exactly the most stable. Thankfully for this video, my phone did decide to want to cooperate, so I was able to get enough footage in one take, and I really didn't have to start over my whole painting here. Speaking of this drawing here, I've had this in my sketchbook for quite a while, and I didn't really have the incentive to want to go back and finish it. That was until I decided to want to make this a series. Because truth be told, I leave a lot of art unfinished. And inherently there isn't always something wrong with that. Not everything has to be a finished illustration. Ideally, a sketchbook should be a playground where you explore different ideas and concepts and figure out how it works with your art style and techniques. However, with how I tend to work with art, if it's something that I can't really finish in 1 or 2 sittings, I pretty much give up on the piece. And like, if I want my own art to grow, I know I need to work past my mental blocks whenever I do feel stuck in a particular piece. I know that this is the case with digital art, because I find it so much more time consuming than normal painting. But it's actually been a while since I did watercolors IRL, so I figured I would open up my watercolor sketchbook and use my Daniel Smith's and my Shinhan watercolors. I'll probably go in depth about my watercolor process in another video, but basically what I do for my watercolor pieces is I start with a base layer, or like an underpainting, and I normally start off with my Shinhan professional watercolors, the mid-range version, not the bougie, high-end, expensive version. Why I do this is that my Shinhan watercolors don't really tend to granulate too much, and I actually want my first few washes to be pretty flat. I do generally like granulation in watercolors, but it tends to get a bit muddy the more I layer on. That's something that I especially noticed on this particular watercolor paper. This is the Reflections Watercolor Journal, which as far as I know, this paper is a mix between wood and actual cotton. The paper in this sketchbook is fine, but the spine itself in the sketchbook sometimes just quits on you for no reason. Like, I don't tend to go out much with this sketchbook, but even now, I'm already starting to see the wear and tear in it. I'm not sure if I bought a bad book or something, but yeah, that's kind of a hassle to deal with, so I haven't really been using this paper very much. And I really don't want to tear out these pages at risk of having the whole book fall apart on me. Regardless, once I'm done with the base layer, I move in with my Daniel Smith watercolors to add more values and details. And I don't know if this is an unpopular take or not, but I really don't think that watercolors are that hard to learn. I mean, compared to like other paints like acrylics or oil paints, they take the least amount of setup. And cleanup is also pretty easy with this medium. Now, I will say that not all watercolors are created equally, and that's definitely the case. But there are pretty decent options at pretty much any price range, you just have to know where to look. I'm thinking of doing a video where I compare Crayola watercolors to my Shinhans and my Shinhans to my Daniel Smiths. So if you're into that type of content, then don't hesitate to like this video and subscribe for more. But yeah, the whole goal for this series is just to let loose and be as creative as we want. There are no right or wrong answers when it comes to making art. And I've said it once, and I'll say it again, no one should shame you for whatever art supplies you have available. While certain tools do make the process easier, it is still definitely possible to make great art with limited resources. I remember I started my art Instagram page almost 10 years ago using art supplies that I got from the dollar store because that was all I could afford back then. And low-key, the dollar store does have some banger art supplies. I'm thinking about doing a separate video about that as well. And while we're on the subject of cheaper art supplies, I noticed that one complaint that a lot of beginner artists have with watercolors is that it smudges their graphite whenever they try to paint over it. And as a result, their colors turn out a bit more muddy than they intended. And like one workaround I noticed to this problem is to sketch with colored pencils. I mainly use my Crayola color pencils for this purpose. They are hard enough to sketch with, and they don't smudge. Other cheaper colored pencils can also do the same job. Yes, even rose art. I don't think I would use normal Prismacolor pencils because they're a bit too waxy for this particular goal. But like low-key, regular Crayola colored pencils, they almost feel like very thin pencils, and they're much cheaper. If you don't really want to see your lines at all after you do your painting, you could also use watercolor pencils. Just make sure not to be too heavy-handed with your initial sketch. But in my case, I tend to use that as part of the underpainting layer, so it all works out in the end. Another complaint that I've seen with people who use watercolors or just starting out with watercolors is that they're too impatient to let the layers dry. Now, I don't know if it depends on the type of brand that you're using, but between cheaper brands and more expensive brands, I can't really say that my watercolors take that long to dry. Like, even in my first few layers when I did my Shinhan watercolors, it didn't take that long for them to dry. Now, I will say it really does depend on what paper you use because some papers are more absorbent than others, but I have experimented on wooden watercolor paper and cotton watercolor paper, and I even used mixed media paper, and even then it didn't really seem to take more than a few minutes to dry, at least more to where you can actually work with it. I'm pretty liberal when it comes to the amount of water that I use in my first washes, but in my personal preference, I do think it's better for your first few layers to be a bit loose. And if you are going to add more details, then do so in a smaller area, that way you have less chance of mistakes. I feel as though if you're not too heavy-handed with your watercolors, it's actually a pretty forgiving medium, even with cheaper paints. That said, it does take some trial and error to figure out how much water you're supposed to use between each layer. But with any medium, it just takes patience to learn all the techniques. In this particular piece, I actually mainly stayed to the primary colors here. Although I did do a few dips into my greens and purples in certain areas to darken things up a bit. But I didn't really want to go over certain areas too many times because I didn't want my piece to look overworked. Because I too used to struggle with that when I started out using watercolors. I think that sometimes another thing that artists do sometimes struggle with when they're learning watercolors is mixing too much. And what I mean by that is trying to mix the paint once it's already on the paper, and that really doesn't always work, even with thicker watercolor papers. I think watercolors are much easier to work with in layers as opposed to mixing on the paper. Because what I like about watercolors is their subtlety. I like seeing how the granulation works with different color mixes, and I feel like I don't really need to interact with that too much. Just letting the colors flow gives a more natural look in my opinion. And in cases where I think I've used a bit too much water or I went in a little bit too dark, I just go over it with a paper towel and it lifts off pretty quickly. Something else that also can help you give your watercolor paintings a bit more depth is actually leaving your watercolor paper somewhat white, and by that I mean no paint. A natural highlight of the paper itself is more oftentimes enough when it comes to adding highlights to your piece. I guess seeing me do footage of watercolors is making me want to talk about the process a bit more, which, hey, I actually do enjoy doing. As far as the piece itself, it's just a picture that I got off of Pinterest, nothing too fancy, just me studying the different lighting in this particular pose and picture. Believe it or not, I'm not the biggest fan of yellow, but I actually wanted to get this right in this particular piece. I tend to gravitate towards purples and blues, but I tried not to do that here and gravitate towards warmer colors. It also doesn't help that it's been particularly dreary where I'm at currently, so the warm sunny colors actually did help quite a bit here. And back when it actually is summer, then I'll be drawn back to using blues and purples. And I guess it also brings me to the point that it can actually be fun to get out of your comfort zone a bit. And here it's just using colors that I don't normally use in my watercolor paintings. But I do want to use this series as a way to talk about my own characters and my own projects a bit more. Although I'm not really doing that here today. But overall, I've been pretty busy these past few weeks, so it's just nice to sit down and do what I like, which is drawing. And it's also nice not to be in front of a screen all the time to make art. Something else that I tend to do when I do use watercolors is that I tend to use the same brush. Like, I don't really tend to change brushes too much in my process. Just give me a medium round brush and it's pretty much all I need to do watercolors. Out of the whole brush set that I have, I mainly use 1 or 2 brushes at any given time. I'm the type of artist that doesn't really like to go out my way when I'm making art. If I find something that works, I do tend to stick with it. So pretty much what I'm doing here is deepening the background a bit, and truth be told, I probably could have gone a bit darker, but I didn't really want to take focus away from the character here, even though I probably could have went darker in the background face anyways. Backgrounds is definitely something else that I need to be studying a bit more, so I think I'll also take this series to do just that. Like, I try to do studies on stream, and in a lot of ways it is fun. But like, once I need to really study what I'm doing, I think it's better to do that type of stuff offline. But I don't necessarily mind recording the process and talking about what I learned along the way. I talked about wanting to draw a bunch of different backgrounds from like different series, most notably Samurai Jack, because that's sort of the inspiration for my own Webtoons series that I'm working on. So I might be filming that in the near future, because I noticed that the artists there used some traditional art paintings for those particular backgrounds, at least in some instances. Since my webtoon is mainly going to be focused on specific locations, backgrounds is something that I do need to improve on. Although, to be honest, that really wasn't my main focus here. Oh, and here comes something that I hardly ever use, my Himi gouache palette. Don't judge me, my paints are well loved. And I've had this particular palette for like several years at this point. I used to use gouache quite a bit a while back, but I haven't really had much time to do so lately. But I figured in this particular piece, some areas did need a little bit more depth than what watercolors could provide. So I decided to crack open my case in this particular instance. I don't know why or how, but I feel like I'm the only person that owns these paints that haven't had them turn moldy yet. Which is low-key surprising because I do live in a pretty humid climate. I've had these paints for almost 4 years at this point, but they have never molded on me. And I'm actually pretty thankful for that. I just don't really know what else to do with them apart from adding a few details to certain pieces. The whole process of going out and cleaning these and remixing them just seems like so tedious to me. I think that if I ever buy another set of gouache paints, it'll probably be in tubes and not in these pudding cups. Because there's no way that I paint that often where I would use them all before they dry up. And like rewetting and remixing them just doesn't seem like something that I really want to spend the time doing. Not to mention the whole mess from actually doing that in the first place. So unless you really do like using gouache, I would stay away from these paints. They're just cumbersome at this point. Although truth be told, I'm pretty sure Himi or Mia do have a tube set which is better for, I guess, transport compared to this. But I haven't tried those yet, so I don't know how they work or the quality of those paints. But yeah, that pretty much brings me to the end of the video. I don't really have anything else really to talk about here, but yeah, I just wanted to announce the beginning of this series and plans that I had for it going forward. And I also gave some tips on how I go about using watercolors. Again, if you made it this far and you enjoy this type of content, then don't hesitate to like and subscribe. With this series that takes less editing on my part, I hope to upload more frequently on my channel. Because the YouTube has actually been growing pretty well. I'm almost up to 200 subscribers, which is hard to believe because I started this channel like 8 or 9 months ago. I think May pretty much officially marks a year for this channel, and the growth that I had is pretty much insane, so I want to keep creating for you guys, and I want this place to be an outlet for my own creativity. So yeah, until my next live stream or video, goodbye, peace.